Harriet Harman, you are 71 years old. You've been a force in our politics for decades. What stage of life are you at now? What does 71 feel like to Harriet Harman?
Well, I mean, to think that I was first elected when I was just 32, which was, as you say, not recently. And I think that what I'm finding quite energising is the issue of the kind of feminist journey into ageing, because there's been a thing whereby, you know, when you're younger in politics, you're kind of too pretty, distractingly attractive, too young. Then when you're a bit older and you're having your children, too many children, hands full, just, you know, can't hack it, too preoccupied. And then when you're older, you're past it. And you never seem to have your prime. Whereas with men, when they're younger, they're up and coming, somebody to watch, dynamic. Then when they've got loads of children, reassuringly virile. And then when they're older and grey, then that's wisdom, a bit of the George Clooney, bit attractive silver fox type of thing. And they seem to have their prime all the way through. And us women struggle to have our prime at any time. So I'm now firmly deciding that I am in my prime and I'm embracing ageing. I'm positively going grey and thinking that there's nothing wrong with being older. In fact, because you know a load of things and you've experienced a lot of things and you've got a different perspective, you know, age can be a superpower, not a disability, even for a woman. And yet we're all supposed to be trying to look younger, trying to make our hair look like it did when we were 30, trying to wear clothes that, you know, make you look young and as if you're a reproductive prospect. You know, and the point is to have a sort of meaningful existence which doesn't depend on all of those things. So it's a bit of a new frontier, really, where there's lots of feminists of my generation who've got to my age, and we're now crafting the journey into feminism age-wise.
Why did you never stand to be Labour leader, Harriet?
Well, I've got dreadful double standards on this because I look around the world and I see women who are like deputies and think, step up. Why don't you be standing for Prime Minister? You'd be miles the best. And yet when I was deputy and Gordon Brown stood down as leader, I didn't stand for leader. Although lots of people in the Labour Party started to say, when I was doing Prime Minister's questions and things like that, they were saying, why aren't you standing for leader? And I think that it just sounds so pathetic. But I felt I had the confidence within the party, but I'd had such a battering in my political journey that I just didn't feel that I could take the Labour Party from that transition from opposition into government. Partly because I'd always been challenging the press, challenging everybody, you know, and demanding progress. And it doesn't make you very sort of leadershipy. It makes you more like an outsider and a challenger. So I felt really, I don't know, when there was like an absolute swarm of men going for it, and I just thought, oh, it might be him or it might be him. And I sort of screened out those people who said, you should be doing it. And of course, I don't know whether I would have done a brilliant job or I would have been hopeless. But the point about the men is they don't seem to reflect on that. They don't ask themselves, if I get it, will I be any good? They ask themselves the question, will I get it? Well, I think I would have definitely got it, and I think I knew that. But I was inhibited by thinking that I might not be the best person, which is kind of a bit of a quaint view.
You have many people who sort of worship you because of the strides that you've taken for women, and you have been mocked along the way too. When people, I mean, it's sort of a flippant thing, but it probably didn't feel it, when people used to refer to you, because you were so politically correct, not as Harriet Harman, but as Harriet Harperson. Does it hurt? Do you laugh about those things?
Well, and also Harriet Harman, they used to call me that as well. But it was part of a concerted undermining, really. It wasn't a friendly and ironic thing. It was quite, it was a hostile thing, and it used to make me feel very beleaguered. But I think, and I'm doing these interviews of women all around the world in different parliaments, and what's interesting about the next generation of women is when they're criticised for something which is about them being a woman, they turn it round and use it against the people who are criticising them. So, for example, as a woman in the Bahamas who was accused of being like just a street trader woman in order to denigrate her, and she said, those women who are street traders, they work hard, they feed their family, they help feed you, they don't do any robbing or dishonesty. If I'm going to be called a street trader, I'm going to be proud of that. And actually, I should have said, if you call me Harriet Harperson or Harriet Harman, I'm going with that. And actually, you're going to have to change because things aren't right. So, but I think now there are more women, we're more able to turn things round against the voices that are always the backlash, that are always the detractors. But, you know, there were so few women in Parliament at the time. We were such a minority that you couldn't take people on or you'd have just got flung out of the system.
And you were elected in 1982 in a by-election. What was Parliament like for a woman coming in 1982?
Well, it was, you know, the pinnacle of the patriarchy. There is no other way to describe it. You know, there were 21 women amongst 650 MPs, and most of those MPs saw women as what their wives did, which is support the men. That was the role for a woman, to support a man to be his best self. And it was a bit subversive to be coming in and wanting to be on equal terms and wanting to share decision making instead of just be admiring them and supporting them. And so it was very difficult. And the argument that actually Parliament should be equal numbers of women and men, because that is a representative Parliament in a population which is equal numbers of women and men, felt like a terrible threat to the men. Are you saying we're not good enough? Well, we were saying that the institution is not right in a country where women regard themselves as equal citizens. If it's all the men doing all the talking and all the men doing all the deciding, and we want to share in that. But for all those who felt it was going to push them aside, they were very anxious about that. And all the measures we put forward, like insisting that there should be some women on the shadow cabinet, which had previously been all male, was regarded by every man who himself wanted to get on the shadow cabinet as a direct attack on him. So it wasn't just a dispassionate argument. It was regarded as very hostile and subversive. So it was an embattled situation, and it wasn't really until 1997, when we had the 100 Labour women coming in, that suddenly it was like, phew, there's a whole load of people on the same page arguing the same issues for childcare, against male violence against women, for equal pay. Suddenly, it was like a normal conversation instead of being a beleaguered minority.
You referenced 1997. Of course, that transformation came about because of something that you were campaigning for. You were a leading campaigner for, and that was the introduction of women-only shortlists, which delivered that mass influx of women. The Labour Party is now just over 50% women MPs, so this will be the first election at the next election, because elections are happening at the moment, and they're not using women on a shortlist because that 50% has been reached. What are going to be the implications of that?
Well, I mean, all women shortlists, as you say, were incredibly important, and they not only changed the face of Parliament and the public policy agenda by all these Labour women coming in, but they also prompted a change in the Conservative Party, because they looked terribly old-fashioned. When their benches were all men in grey suits, they were like, well, actually, we've got loads of women in the Conservative Party. We've got to show that we're a party of women as well as men. So it prompted change in the Conservative Party as well as in the whole of Parliament. And the argument is that legally, because we're now at 50%, we can no longer do it. It's about redressing inequality, and you can't do it if you've reached that equality. But actually, we could still do it, and I think we should. Not least, for example, in one region, in the southeast region outside London, only 2 of our 8 MPs are women. So at the very least, there's an argument for doing it there. And I think you do have to be careful, because you can always slip back. So we're at 50% now because of this positive action policy. Without it, we could in one fell swoop slip right back. So I think we should try and find ways within the law to actually keep all women shortlists, because we can't be complacent. There's always a backlash. I mean, you know, the men have had their turn for many hundreds of years. We've had a little window of opportunity, but there's plenty of people that think, actually, it's their turn now again.
So, as we said, you were elected in 1982. You're the mother of the house. You're the longest serving female MP in Parliament. You witnessed, of course, there was a wonderful Labour victory, but you witnessed 1983 defeat, 1987 defeat, 1992 defeat, 2010 defeat, 2015 defeat, 2017 defeat. You've been in Parliament for a lot of Labour defeats. Are there any patterns that you have witnessed during the decades that you have observed Labour defeats and thought there are characteristics which the Labour Party has when we go wrong?
Well, I think the lessons we can learn from where we actually went right, which was in 97 and then those subsequent elections, were actually when we came to terms with the fact that you have to listen to what the voters are saying to you, and that you cannot tell them that they're wrong. And there used to be a jokey saying on the left, no compromise with the electorate. Well, if you don't compromise with the electorate and listen to what they're saying, they don't vote for you. And there's that awful moment in the run-up to elections when you're out campaigning all around the country and you speak to people and they see your Labour rosette and they don't look you in the eye. And it's basically, they think that you are there to promulgate your judgment onto them and tell them they're wrong and tell them what to think because you think you know better. And it's all about listening to what people want and taking that on board. You still have your Labour principles, your Labour values, but you've got to put those principles and values in the context of where people are with their lives. And that was really the kind of genius of New Labour. I mean, it sounds rather basic, but it was a big transformation. Instead of us waiting for the public to wake up because they were just so wrong and so stupid to keep voting Conservative, we were like, perhaps the problem is with us, and perhaps we need to change. So we did a whole thing of changing. You know, why is it that even though you're fed up with the Tories, you still don't want to vote for us? And we made those changes. So I think it's about levelling with your own, what it is that people think is wrong with you in terms of the electorate, and not waiting for them to see the light, but actually addressing their concerns.
In 1997, which I was involved in that election as well. I remember what it felt like, but I certainly wasn't in Parliament. You go straight into the Cabinet as Social Security Secretary. You're fired within a year. That must have felt very brutal.
Well, it did, because having campaigned to get Labour into government for 13 years, to only myself survive in government for like 13 months, there was a sort of grisly symmetry about that. But overall, I was just so relieved we weren't in opposition. And I did wish the government well, even though I had been tossed out and, you know, had been denigrated throughout the press. It's very humiliating to be kind of, you know, sacked from the Cabinet. But I do think that with the advice and support of various people, because these things are never just what you do yourself, I did being fired really well, because I didn't go bitter, I didn't turn nasty against the government, and I tried to remember that when something bad happens to you, quite often it's not everybody else's fault. Sometimes you can have contributed to why you seem to be deep in the mud. And I did work out what I should have done differently and just pressed on with, and I remember I went to see Gordon Brown, who I'd been his deputy and worked very closely with him when we were in opposition and, you know, and when we were in government. And I said, what am I going to do now? I mean, I was an MP, but, you know, I'd always been part of that team. And he said, well, what do you care about? So I said, well, you know, God, there's no childcare, you know, men are beating up women and murdering them, there's no equal pay, this, that and the other. And he said, well, just do that. And the thing is that substance is what matters. So whatever position you're in, the question is, what do you care about? What do you want to change? So I thought, oh, that's good advice. So I cracked on with all of that, and then eventually I was put back into government and could do that from within government. So I think, the tendency is to turn in yourself, blame everybody else, think there's nothing you can do, and actually, so long as you've got the privilege of being an MP, there are things that you can do and make a difference.
A final question on women in Parliament. Two of the Prime Ministers you have witnessed on the Conservative side have been women. Women have done very poorly, actually, in Labour leadership contests. It's always manana, we will have a Labour woman leader. Never happens, does it?
Well, it's, we're not going to be having a leadership election anytime soon. I'm strongly supportive of Keir Starmer and want him to get elected and be Prime Minister. But actually, as and when we do in the far distant future have another leadership election, it has got to be a woman next time round, because it's just downright embarrassing that the Conservatives have had two and we haven't even had a woman leader in opposition, let alone a woman Prime Minister. And I think it's partly because women in the Labour Party are more subversive than the women in the Conservative Party. The women in the Conservative Party tend to work with men without challenging them in quite the way we do.
Oh, come on, Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah, but she beat the men on their own terms. She didn't change the agenda. She was like the best man there. Whereas we're wanting to change the context and change all the organisation. And that is much more threatening to the organisation, and therefore you build up more kind of hostility along the way. I mean, that's the only sort of semi-reasonably pathetic justification for it. It's just bad, really. And we've got lots of excellent women who could step forward for being leader, as we have done for quite a few years. So, like next time. So I'm always saying next time.
I know.
Having not stepped up myself, so I have to sort of say it in a relatively humble voice, since I didn't quest myself to do that.
So you're standing down at the next election, but you've just been given this big job, perhaps thankless job, of chairing the parliamentary investigation into whether the Prime Minister deliberately or knowingly misled Parliament. How will you approach that, or why have you taken it on?
Well, I think it's one of those things, the Privileges Committee is one of those things that you do on behalf of the House, but you don't talk about it. And so at this point, I'm really just, it's the doing it rather than talking about it. So I'm not really doing a commentary of any sort on it, I'm afraid.
Okay, fair enough. Final question, this personal question, which I hope you don't mind me asking, but you married Jack Dromey, your husband, in 1982, and you lost him very recently. How are you?
Well, I'm not entirely sure what the answer to that question is, because it's just 6 months since he died, and he died absolutely suddenly, out of the blue. And I feel that widowhood is something that happens to most women who married or have got a partner. Widowhood does happen to them, but there's a real mystery to me in terms of what is the, how you kind of go forward in your life. But I mean, I do know that, well, my mum lived till she was 100 and I'm 70. I might have another 30 years. So that I can't be like, well, because Jack has died, my life is over. And we've always argued you can't just define yourself by the man that you're with. But it is it's a huge change if you've kind of more or less developed with somebody and your whole lives are intertwined, and then suddenly they're not there anymore. But I've got children, I've got grandchildren, I've got my constituents. So in a way, I've got no option but to what they describe as crack on. So I'm like cracking on. And I know it sounds corny, but that's what Jack would be wanting me to be doing. But it's easier to talk about it than to walk the talk. So I'm working on the walk the talk side of things. But mostly, I've got lots of blessings in my life. So I must count those.
Harriet Harman, thrilled that you agreed to do this interview. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Thank you.